welcome to my presentation. Today I will talk to you about the evolution of ethics in psychological research. So here I will try to answer the question, how did ethical considerations develop in psychology research? Let's first introduce the topic of ethics. So according to Kitchener, ethics are a branch of philosophy focused on how people should act, on the moral judgments about those actions, and on developing rules to justify given actions. It is very important in science to have ethics because research uses humans and non-humans as subjects, and as we consider today, science is not above right and wrong. Throughout the history of psychology and its development as their own discipline, psychology's stance towards ethics changed as well. There are also some conflicts about how to approach psychology's ethics, and there is this opposition between the deontological approach, which is also referred as the absolutist position, versus the utilitarianism approach, and the cost-benefits approach, which I will discuss later. Throughout the presentation, I will talk first about the pre-ethical content, so the period before when psychology was not really interested into ethics. Then I will talk about the increase of ethical considerations. Then I will discuss the dilemmas and the reluctance for change that psychology researchers had. Then I will focus on the unethical studies scandals that allowed for a development in ethics consideration in psychology and the rise of guidelines and ethical codes of conduct for researchers. Later on, I will discuss the deception problem, which is kind of central regarding ethics and social psychology. Then I will talk about the globalization of ethics norms, which is the current era we are in. From the 19th century, which is the beginning of psychology as a distinct practice from other scientific disciplines, ethics are considered as a personal matter. There are no guidelines, no codes, no consideration concerning the ethics of a psychologist or of psychological research. There are only a few articles, but the first consideration of ethics in psychology actually depicts the fact that it's important to get an ethic behavior with the obligation of the psychologist to behave well, and the first guidelines is actually about animals. But actually, regarding animals' ethics, the ethics were more focused on the rights of monkeys, apes, and also dogs, and I believe it can be explained because of anthropomorphism. We are according more rights and we are more interested in ethics concerning those because we are close to them. We feel close to dogs because we're living with them, and we feel close to monkeys because we are from the same species. The 1940s until the 80s saw a large increase in ethics consideration, which is first explained by Sinclair by the development of psychology that expanded. The second cause is the Nuremberg Code that was done after the Nazi scientist trials. It highlights the importance for that participants give an informed consent for participating to studies. It also asks for the balance of risks and benefits of a study, and finally, it states that harming individuals to society's benefit is unacceptable. So here it is following a deontological perspective because we consider the rights of humans to be above science and we don't want any exceptions, while the utilitarianism would state that we need to look at the benefits of sacrificing the rights of people to progress of science. However, Schuller's paper adds nuance. The APA, American Psychologists Association, states some ethical standards in research, but in fact, the researchers have great freedom of decision. From the different articles I've read, a key question is where we stand between deontologism, with the moral value that human rights are above science, without exception, and an utilitarianist standpoint. Knowledge, progress, and practical applications of research, etc., is worth sacrificing a bit of morality towards the subject, according to utilitarianism. The ethical dilemma arises from the presence of both desire to do worthwhile research, challenged by the desire to avoid harm to subjects, Eisner states. In fact, if the researcher is only interested into the progress of science, he won't see the problem in harming or deceiving subject, before to him the consequences will be good. Yes, there will be harm done and it will be negative for the subjects, but in the end, it will help people in the long term after that. This is severely challenged by Eisner. Another problematic raised by Schuller is the power of the experimenter and the submissiveness of the subjects. Because the experimenter has every power and he can determine unilaterally what is relevant or not in the study, even the subjects tend to accept that for them to be deceived and harmed. And they are gonna follow what the researcher is asking them to do because of their authority. There is also a social power and with an evaluation apprehension which adds up to the power of the experiment. There is also this idea of social contract, which can be found in several work of my sources, as Sinclair, Scholar, and others. You could think that with the development of ethics in the field of psychological research, there would be less unethical problems. However, even with the publication of articles on ethics, since early 1940s, we saw, notably with social psychology, that in practice ethics were not applied, and subjects would suffer from researchers who would not mind harming them and deceiving them, as explained before, because they would believe in progress of science above human individual rights. Schuller adds there was a lack of concern about those ethics guidelines, and even amusement about misinforming and misleading subjects. Rowling covered the topic of animal ethics, and he saw that there was a lot of resistance. There was notably logical positivism in science that was arguing that only empirical assertions were meaningful and that science was ethics-free. It was above all moral norms. Sinclair's depict 4 studies that were really important and that led to large rise of attention to research ethics in psychology. Those 4 unethical studies went viral and created scandals. So first you have the Tuskegee syphilis experiment, which observed American men that were inoculated syphilis without their knowledge nor consent, and they were observed for 40 years. They were not treated and only the worst cases were studied. Even when a medication was developed, they were not treated. So they basically watched their subject die. So there was a huge scandal because the CIA sponsored several research on brainwashing using LSD during many years. There was also the Milgram's obedience study that's really famous to understand how the atrocities of World War II with Nazis happened. He wanted to test how far could people go obeying to a figure of authority. He asked subjects to push a button that would give electric shocks to another subject that was actually a Confederate. It wasn't a real subject. The electric shocks were not real, but that the real subjects didn't know. Participants went until administrating the lethal amount of charge. It wasn't real, but they didn't know it wasn't. As Eisner mentions, this has a lot of consequences and it harms the subjects. Here it is not like the syphilis experiment, they are not suffering from a disease, but they are decepted and they believe they killed people. The orders of an authority person, but they still believe they did it. Lastly, there is the Zimbardo's Stanford prison. He created a fake prison with fake prisoners that were half of the subjects, and guardians were arbitrarily chosen. The study was actually stopped after 6 days of experiments because the situation had become too violent. Such experiments, it shocked the population. You could think that those methods were exceptions, but actually they were the norm, because deception was so practical and because researchers would believe that progress in science was more important than ethics. Such high-risk experiments with a lot of use of deception were very common. These scandals led to dramatic rise in ethical concerns in psychological research. There was the emergence of codes, guidelines for research ethics, and a big part of the problems was the deception problem. So as Menges defines it, it is when participants in experiments are given misleading, erroneous, or incomplete information. In the same study, he saw that only 3% of APA journals in 1971 had complete information given to the participants. So this is a widely spread phenomenon. Eisner makes a severe portrait of the use of deception and of their defenders. To the researcher, the problem of the deception is its consequences. I talked about it earlier. It can be psychological, it can be physical, it's about the self-esteem maybe, and also it could create mistrust and cynicism towards psychological experiments, which is also very bad for the future of psychological experiments, because with scandals, we talked earlier, the people would now know when participating to a psychological study that the researcher might try to mislead them, they might try to deceive them. So the problem is not only ethical, it's also now a very practical problem in the research. To Kelman, there are alternatives to deception that might be even more efficient than those. He proposes to rely on participants' motivation rather than bypassing it and controlling everything and fooling participants. To him, we should therefore actively use our energy to explore those new approaches. From the 80s until now, we are in a globalization of ethics norms. With the Universal Declaration of Ethical Principles for Psychologists, we have universal and timeless guidelines. We are given guidelines to compare different codes of ethics throughout the world to have matching codes. Sinclair concludes that psychology evolved from self-focus in the 19th century without interest in ethics to a deep interest that was due to all those problematic I presented before, and is now having a deep interest into ethics and understands its responsibility, individual responsibility of researchers, psychologists, as a collective one. The individual responsibility goes also towards the subjects of experiments, who are now protected. Students and researchers are also given ethics trainings, and they have to constantly update their knowledge of ethics. In conclusion, ethics are really difficult. It's philosophy, and so stating norms in psychology research actually depends from our philosophical standpoint. There is no right answer, so it's a never-ending question. To me, it is really important to work on philosophical and epistemological standpoints to rethink our way of apprehending psychology in research. This is a fundamental topic to approach, and even though it's extremely tough, it needs to be done if we want to improve our discipline.